To start off with, for those of you who haven't enrolled, we have a webinar coming up called Crossing the Finish Line. 5 things you can do to expedite your tech projects. I'm very excited about this one. I have noticed that the tech projects are gearing up. We've been talking to a lot of people who are working very hard on catching up from their portfolio. We've had a lot of really good meetings. And what I'm finding is that at times I think that we're more ready to go than they are. And I think there's a way to kind of get that rolling. So I'm going to be talking about things like, what it would be like to have a packet, an onboarding document. You expect the vendors to have an onboarding document, but what would an onboarding document look like for you? So a lot of really cool ideas in there. Hope you can make it. Again, it's bigfintech.com/webinar to sign up. And I'm sure that my lovely assistant, Melissa, will put the link in the chat for anybody that wants to go and sign up, April 22nd. With that, let's move forward. Welcome to this Town Hall 54. It's Wednesday. And we've got a great guest today, and we'll get into it here. We're not going to have Mr. Mike Lawson today. He's out, so I'm solo today. Let's move on to the next slide. So it's just going to be myself. But in the meantime, we'll just give a nod to our sponsors, the people who have really just stepped up to help us make this happen. CUNA Councils, for those of you who haven't attended the CUNA Council, absolutely should. They've got the Tech Council, the Marketing Council, the Lending Council. I think I'm speaking at 1 or 2 of those coming up. And they've done a fantastic job of transitioning it to virtual, but they'll be transitioning it back. These conferences are so important because they're the places, and this was actually what this was intended to sort of replace, where you can come, ask a question, get feedback from everyone else, and understand, from your peers what they're doing, and more importantly, find out what the solutions that may be out there for things that you're trying to do. So that collaboration, and we had that discussion last week with Bradley Limer, is the most important aspect of this industry, and we need to do more of it. So how do we do it? Well, things like the CUNA Councils. Correlation, the only core in the cranium business that was made in this century. It's a fantastic backing system. We're thrilled to have them as a partner and a backer for this. Jeff Dent, their CTO, he attends a lot and he gets a lot out of these. He called me and said, "Hey, I want to be part of this." So we're thrilled to have them. Check out Correlation. They're really focused on being an open system, which is something we're going to talk about today. Obviously, Best Innovation Group. We are a voice provider. If you want your cranium to be able to give out your balances to your members on Alexa or something like that, you can do that. We've also been doing a ton of integration work for Q2, for Alchemy, for Bano, all these different products. We have the opportunity to do integrations for you. So we're starting to pull that up. And if you don't check out See a Broadcast, well, you're probably just not breathing. You got to be dead, because Mike is the biggest name in the business of the cranium space in terms of teaching and getting people aboard and that entertainment. And he's just done a fantastic job. So always check out Mike Lawson. Let's move to the next slide. Melissa, are the slides moving for you? They're not moving for me.
It moved for me. I'm not sure what's happening.
All right. Well, I'm just
I'll
going to
stop it. And you can...
Yeah, go ahead and do that. In the meantime, I'm going to introduce our guest. So today we're going to talk about this book here. Our guest today is a longtime friend of mine. He was a founder of OGO. I've heard his name around the industry forever. When I met him, I'm like, how can you be so young? Because I remember just all these different things swirling around. But his name is Kirk Drake. He's authored more than one book. Many of you have probably read CE 2.0. And he called me last year. Actually, I think we hatched this at some conference before everything crashed, like in December or something. We talked about doing an AI book. And we collaborated a bit. I actually wrote the foreword for this, and Kirk finished it and did a fantastic job. This is a great book. Kirk is the CEO of Cranium 2.0, which is a digital marketing organization, as well as finding fintechs and really fostering the same kind of collaboration. He's a partner with us in our innovation club. He has been a huge supporter of BIG from the day we ever existed. And also we're big supporters of his. And as I said, a CEO of OGO, ongoing operations, kind of was, a a thinker of the cloud before the cloud ever even existed. Welcome, Kirk.
Thanks, John. Good to be here today.
I was waiting for you to take a drink, and I was like, aha, there he goes.
Perfect timing. This is my favorite coffee mug. It's the Wake Me Up Before You Go.
Wake me up before you go. And obviously an incredible marketing genius, as you can tell from his coffee cup there. So Kirk, before we get into the book, tell me what you've been up to. Talk to me a little bit about what's been going on in your world with the folks. You know, a lot of people follow you. A lot of people are very interested in what you're doing. Catch us up.
Sure. Yeah. So obviously the last year I've spent sitting on my butt at home, going no place, doing nothing, going through endless Zoom calls like everybody else, learning. I've met my kids now, which is nice. So I think the first 9 years I missed, and then I made up for it all last year.
Yeah. And you're probably good for till they're gone.
I think
you banked enough hours, if I'm right.
I think so. But yeah, so I've been focused on kind of a couple different things. So the most fun, crazy one was my wife and I started a winery about 4 years ago, and we launched that and began selling our first wines in April of last year, doing a bunch of virtual wine tastings and other things like that. And so that was just a very different business, totally obviously outside of credit unions and fintech and technology.
And that was a QSO, right? You got a whole bunch of credit unions to invest in the wine.
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't it called like co-op wine or something? I forget.
Yeah, that would have been awesome, but no. So that was super fun and nice to kind of take things you learn from the credit union industry and from startups and those kind of things and apply it to, probably one of the oldest industries like banking. Wine has been around for 4,000 years and a key part of that. So that was a super fun thing. At the same time, I think CU2, we had really been experimenting pre-COVID with fintech meetup, happy hours, and those kind of things at credit union conferences. And COVID obviously destroyed the conference series. And so we really took what was working well, and we created something called the quarterly fintech call. So we've got a couple hundred credit unions that we have a 30-minute call once a quarter, and we just pitch 5 fintech ideas one-on-one, and we gather all that intel and research back and produce what we call the 2.0 guide. So checking 2.0, small business lending 2.0, you name it. And I'm loving those calls because, when you talk to 250 credit unions a quarter and you talk 5 fintechs each, and we kind of try to make in that process, you just see some really interesting things and you start to get a real good sense for what's going on in the industry. Out of that, we launched a fintech mastermind. So it's about 1/3 credit union people, 2/3 fintech people. And it meets monthly for about an hour and a half. And really our entire goal is to just simply get credit unions to learn from fintechs about how to think a little more entrepreneurial, innovatively, move faster, those kind of things, and how for the fintechs to understand how credit unions think about the world. Because sometimes you get in these funny conversations about, hey, we're trying to solve this problem, and the fintechs all go, well, why don't you solve it this way? And then 4 credit union people explain, the 20-year legacy of why that doesn't work. And it's eye-opening, and you start to see some real pathways be connected in that. And that has led recently to the creation of a fintech fund where not trying to compete with Circle or any of the other things out there, looking for 5 to 10 credit unions that want to do some pilots and want to really leverage our due diligence and our research in those in the quarterly fintech calls and the rest of that to make some good choices in that process. And so seeing that really kind of come together, and then at the same time trying to remember what I wrote in this book 2 years ago. As you know, when you write a book, it takes an inordinate amount of time from when the ideas come out of your head into when they actually turn into something that someone can buy. And so now kind of really launching the book side of that. It's been about 3 years since the first book came out, and love talking about and brainstorming with you. And you were right, it came out of a conference you and I had some mind meld at, and really started getting into thinking about that. And as I wrote the book, what I was blown away with was every single fintech is using machine learning, AI, or external data in some way, shape, or form. And if we look at all of our credit unions out there, we might be playing around with some analytics, we might be playing around with the cloud, but we haven't made that a defined component of our strategies that our life is going to, depend on it. And I think the competitive advantages and the learnings that come out of AI and machine learning and those pieces are really hard to catch up on if you're behind, right? There's
Yeah,
great
I do
example in
think
the book, but
I would agree with that. I think if you're, you could be chasing chasing a bus that you're going the same speed. So, all right, well, let's talk about this. So the book is, by the way, Melissa will post the Amazon link to the book. It's available now. The book itself, hardback is out there. A Kindle version is also there. So both are available on Amazon and several other places. But what I thought was interesting about this book, the concepts, the book seems to be sort of, hey, let's teach everybody about AI, right? Let's get everybody at least on the same level playing field, which is interesting because, we recently had some conversations with a friend of ours, Paul Fiore, about a similar concept with crypto, right? Where one of the first barriers to collaboration is to get everybody on the same page, to get everybody to understand kind of what it is that they're looking at and what the conversation is around. And I feel like sometimes what happens is that particular piece of it, what it'll do is it'll take more time for everybody to come to consensus about what it really is. Kind of like we talked about blockchain versus actual cryptocurrency and how long it took for the industry to sort of get their mind around the sense that those are two different things. So the book starts off with, in my mind, sort of trying to establish for credit union executives what AI is and what it isn't. And that's probably even more important. And just in the beginning of it, you said twice, machine learning and AI, machine learning and AI. I heard you make that statement twice. So let's start there. Let's start with, what you think the most definitive definition is for a credit union of AI versus machine learning that would, catapult them in the direction of having an understanding and where to go with this.
yeah, so I think at its most basic level, if we think back to kind of the .com space, machine learning is getting your first website, right? And online banking is, kind of the next stage, which we refer to as super AGI. And then there's a third layer beyond that, which is really kind of the collective, where all of these things start, you have the Internet of Things, right, where these things start talking and automating between them. And so I think it's important to note that all of the machine learning stuff is really our first crack at using existing business models or data models to learn things from the data. But that's totally different than where we're going to be 10 years from now, when those folks that have learned things from the data begin to take the next step, and conclusions are made from that, as opposed to conclusions and automations and things happen, as opposed to just simply, oh, this happened.
Yeah, one of the things you talked about in the book was the shift from this idea of historical, which is we've always had with the ability to run a report. The next piece was that that idea of being proactive and predictive, and to say, okay, this is what we think is going to happen based on that history. And then that next level was that prescriptive, which was influencing what you want to happen. And, I think you and I have said for a long time that we just recently mastered the historical, and we're starting to get into the predictive. Now, some predictive aspects of this, which you mentioned in the book, have been around a long time, like, for example, predicting the number of callers that will call into a call center using an algorithm. And that's based on historical fact. And many credit unions have been using that forever to staff their call center or to staff their teller line. So that's a form of, but it's really a form of machine learning as opposed to the concept of AI, this artificial intelligence, right? So in your mind, tell me what you think or what you most hear, and I've got my own stories around this, but what, when you talk to a credit union about AI, what do you find that they think it is? And conceptually, where do
so conceptually, I think what I hear mostly is, oh, we're doing some analytics and some machine learning and maybe some predictive analytics, or we're plugging into our loan underwriting, piece of it. What I tried to really identify in the book was that it's much more complex than that. It's, and especially in credit unions, one of the things I like to highlight is for AI to be effective long term, you need this huge amount of data, which as an industry we have, but as individual credit unions, we probably don't in most cases. And the secondary piece of this, you need data that is unbiased and normalized. And credit unions by default are biased data because we've been built around commonality of teachers or of seg groups or of communities, which means inherently we inject bias in everything we're doing if we just look at the data. And that's when you see like the Amazon problem where they plug in, 100,000 resumes and tell it, find me people that look like our best hires. It turns out their best hires are all white men, right? And that turns out to be a real problem, right?
Right, because the bias is based on pat. I mean, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy based on the data that you feed it.
Right.
So I love that concept, and there's a whole ton of case studies in here.
Yep.
One of the case studies you immediately dived into was probably the area where I think true AI is advancing the fastest, which was natural language processing, otherwise known as NLP. So, as you know, I happen to have a little bit of a stake and a bias in this, given that, and you and I discussed this many years ago. I saw this coming and I said, hey, we could type faster than we can write. We're going to have some sort of natural language connection. And that makes sense to me because UX is untenable as a continuing concept, particularly in more advanced transactions. You look at like an insurance transaction. Yeah, everybody's made the effort to simplify it through these kinds of things. But the reality of the situation is that no one's ever really cracked that nut for some of the more complex financial transactions because it's just too hard to do. And that's why people exist and there are people to hold your hand through this. So talk to me a little bit about what you've seen out there in that regard and how that plays into things. And let's back up before you get into that, just real quickly. The other concept you talk about is this idea that general AI doesn't exist, right? So that's something I hear a lot from credit unions is, oh, we're gonna have some just big giant AI, this brain that kind of pulses in the middle of the lobby under glass is kind of how I see it. Like remember the old Star Trek episode where they stole Spock's brain to run their city, I think is what they did. Something like that is this sort of centralized AI concept, but you discount that almost immediately in the book. And then you kind of turn into the natural language processing as an entry point to understand, an area of how that might enter. So maybe share a little bit about that.
Yes. So I think if you look at NLP and, it's taken all this or even conversational NLP or any of those pieces where they take this huge amount of data and begin to make these correlations that when someone says moolah, it means money and those pieces. And then you layer on the fact that I think it's predicted by in the next 2 to 3 years, basically Google's better at translating than anything, we're able to do as a human. We're on the cusp of this point where languages don't really matter anymore, right? And the machines are better at understanding the nuance of our languages in that context. And if you think about it, I remember as a kid, you're learning how to write on a program on a TRS 80 or something like that. And then you got WordStar, and then suddenly there's spell check, and all of our parents are going, "Oh, you guys are gonna be morons. You're never gonna be able to, spell things." Well, it turns out I don't really actually need to be all that good at spelling things, right? I need to be able to mostly get a concept of a word down, and the computer's pretty good at fixing that. And then it was, well, we can't.
Except for me, it can't even figure out sometimes what I'm trying to spell. I have to ask Alexa.
Yeah, don't ask me to spell restaurant. I'm totally capable of that one. Then you go on to, well, it can't handle grammar. Well, it turns out Grammarly is pretty good at handling grammar, and I don't actually need to be all that good at the grammar piece of it. And so you start, the next extrapolation is, can it, create a paper? Could it put thoughts together? And it turns out we're not that far away,
there was actually an article written not too long ago entirely by AI. And, it was, I forget what happened with it, but it was one of the major publications that posted that.
Right. So at some point when all that self-learning and the machines, start to figure things out and move forward, whether it's in NLP where, you think about how many miscommunications and how many things go on at their call centers and all those pieces, that the barrier was the language or the nuance in that. And that's really going to evaporate pretty quickly, and be much more efficient in that context. And so, I think, from an individual perspective, one of the things I find really fascinating about the book is really getting us on our own to think about where our careers are going and what skills we're actually going to need. Right. And then, and one of those great examples of I assume you've played around like PowerPoint, where they have the slide recommendations. If you're using Office 365 versus, by the way, it's a great parallel. If you're using PowerPoint on your desktop, not the Office 365 version, you got to design your own slides. If you're using PowerPoint on Office 365, there's a little button that you push and it gives you design ideas, and it gives you 9 great AI created design ideas on every slide that are far better than any of us can create on our own in seconds. And you just pick your favorite one and move on to the next slide. And you just have to type a couple words, and now you've got a beautiful PowerPoint deck. I mean, I think that's, the leverage of cloud and processing combined with NLP and those pieces. It's just going to be game changing. Everything that's not connected is just going to be left behind.
Yeah. So speaking of that, interestingly enough, I was just listening to an article or an interview with a famous rear admiral. He just finished a book called 2034 that was featured in Wired, and he talked about the internet and the surface. So I guess I think it was 2012 or 2013. There are 7 billion people on the planet and about 7 billion devices connected. Today we have over 30 billion devices connected, but we still just about only have 7 billion people on the planet, or a little bit more.
Right.
And so all of those devices, as they connect, are now feeding information. So for example, you think about any kind of appliance, and what could it feed back? What would they use it for? Well, they would use it for determining maintenance. They would use it for determining the wattage. But if I'm back in the finance space, and before I get into what they should look for, let's talk about the career structure just for a minute. So if the org structure is such that currently, a traditional credit union organization structure, you got a CFO, a COO, CTO, and lately I've been seeing chief data officers, which I think is fantastic. Where does AI fit into that space? If I'm looking at, if I'm looking at that, what is there someone who's in charge of AI, or does it need that high up, or is it broken into each department, or is that a mistake, or, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's a mistake to do it by department. I think the credit unions that are going to do best at this are going to put someone in that role, put a system in place. We got frameworks, et cetera, to figure out where can it have the biggest impact, to go through the ethical discussions, to figure out the compliance concerns, those pieces. And then as you figure out that structure and how it's going to overlay, it's almost like the member experience officer, where they kind of flit around in all these different areas, but they have to have this this ability to go influence everything in the organization while probably not being responsible for the deployment or impact of those things, right? And so I think it's going to be similar in that regard, where they've got to understand the technology, they've got to understand the data, they've got to understand the business well enough to know that says, if I turn this on, here's the type of things that can happen. How do I watch it? How do I make sure it's doing what we want it to do, and that we can validate and track back and prove to regulators that this thing is behaving the way we expected it to, right?
So you're advocating sort of a chief AI officer in a department, and if I'm hearing you right, one of the reasons for that is because one of the superpowers of AI is correlation, right? Like understanding a continuum of events and then predicting the next or influencing the next. So being able to say, hey, I need to know what's going on in the call center, but I also need to know what's going on in the treasury,
right.
Because it may affect our rates on these assets, or maybe the AI is smart enough to go, hey, now isn't a good time to dump more equity into the mortgage market. But that also needs to translate into a behavior within the organization to back down that queue, or to turn off that spigot by increasing a rate or something.
Yeah, and if you look at each, I try to go through it in each part of the book of looking at.
That's good. Yeah,
looking at collections, looking at lending, looking at accounting. Each of those things has some discipline difference of how it's going to work. And yes, they all collectively need to work as well, just like, I think eventually all the credit unions will want to share their data and insights in that. But I think at this point, just recognizing and making sure that you put some framework around, hey, if we're going to be looking at 3 new LOSs, let's make sure that they've got a legit AI strategy as part of their long-term plan. Because if we pick the one without an AI strategy and we're sitting here, 2 years from now, I think one of the big challenges I see in credit unions is we have this rip and replace problem, right? Where we're constantly churning through older systems, trying to upgrade to the next for some marginal improvement in it. And I think a lot of that comes down to really picking technology providers and businesses that are aligned much more culturally with our long-term goals and growth objectives, and aligned with a broader picture thinking in the first place. And it's not about the exact widget of today, but really, that longer term play in that respect.
Yeah, and you mentioned in the end here this AI playbook, right? This idea that okay, we're going to need sort of a plan to move forward. And in your playbook, you talk about some of the areas that you think will be early sort of adopters of AI that are going to make the most sense. And it's funny because it's a little bit of a rehash in the sense that, and I love that you covered every department to some extent around how it affect each department. We talked about that, like, hey, if we can stick it in there, where's it go? But Falcon, which is a platform that determines suspicious activity on credit cards, has been in place forever. Yet, and there has been and still are great systems for like Guardian Analytics and whatnot for the online that intuit sort of anomalies in behavior. But again, those are all sort of predictive in a way, not prescriptive. So talk a little bit about that AI playbook and how you would, and then I want to take some questions from folks, but
Sure.
How you would see that proceeding.
Yeah, so I love that example in the book because FlexPay went out and they were just trying to solve a completely different problem around merchant card not present recurring transactions, which most credit unions and credit union processors pay no attention to, but are a huge source of interchange. And unintentionally reverse engineered Falcon in a heuristics model in a matter of 3 to 6 months with more data. And now they're able to increase throughput of those recurring non-present transactions for their merchants successfully 40% more often, which greatly reduces the card processing cost for those merchants in a weird way. But if you think and you took that technology and you put it in the hands of a fraudster, right, now we're really screwed because it wouldn't take that long for them to just play a series of transactions against the credit union. And I can tell you personally, the number of false positives my credit unions cause on my cards is, and my banks, so I don't think it's unique. It blows me away at how bad they are at actually predicting whether it's a good transaction or not in that equation, yet they never seem to actually catch the fraud, right?
Yeah, and you mentioned the heuristics of it, which is is a great example of heuristics. Is not necessarily AI, nor is it. It's a subtext or a sub category of machine learning that's been around for a while. But it's really, and I've noticed, I think those have dropped quite a bit since travel has slowed down, because that was its number one way of sort of determining those things. And as always, the fraudsters are moving that. So I read an interesting article. I don't know if you follow Brian Krebs on security, but now what's happening, and this has started happening in Brazil and now is filtering here, is the bad guys now have access to AI. So it's cycled down enough to where, and what that means is that they were manually sort of looking through all of their target processes and all of those things, and then they were basically turning that around and finding what they wanted. Now the AI will narrow everything down for them and then persist trying to, it's basically, I think of it like if I had to go, let's say I'm trying to get out of a fenced in area and I'm walking around with a stick trying to figure out which part's not electrocuted. Well, I'm only one person. I could only walk around so many fences and poke, Now these guys can basically be walking around 1,000 fences at once and find all the the areas. So in the book, you talk about that being yet another place to start is in true cybersecurity, because what's happened is the AI, and you mentioned this in the book, has created a bigger attack surface. Not only are all those devices another attack surface, but AI itself is an attack surface, right?
Right.
Because it's made up of data. It's not a human, and therefore theoretically, if you can figure out what's going on, can be gamed, right?
Yep.
So talk a little bit about that, and kind of how you see that evolving.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think the fraudsters are going to keep us on our toes in that regard, and it's something we have to be aware of. And I think one of the really key things in that is their ability to find, so say they find the exploit, right? And then they sit on it while they get everything else they need, and then they play through 10,000 transactions before we can even respond. Right. So we're already living in this crazy real-time, super fast-paced world, and it's just going to get worse in that. And so you're going to have, you've seen it, you've got security AI tools that do event correlation. And we were looking at some interesting tech that does, so in ongoing operations, we can plug in all the event logs from the tens of thousands of devices we have across all the credit unions, routers and switches and servers. And then it can predictively tell us where there's going to be massive failure, right, of some cascading event, and can automatically produce both change control and root cause analysis after the fact when these things go on, right? And there's no way we can have a human look at 10,000 devices and try to make that correlating, set of information. But the fact that we can plug in these engines and do that, both from a day-to-day production perspective, but also from a security perspective, these are going to be game-changing things in the pace at which we have to learn and grow in our organizations.
What I thought was interesting was I read an article just recently, and it didn't make the book because it's pretty new, but is the social engineering that has been moving on. So one of the things they'll do is go into LinkedIn and try to find someone in your organization who they think would, their PC or their account would have access to the things that they want to get at. And then in the past, what they've done is, go in and find their Facebook and go try to send something from what looks like a friend and go, oh, I remember this. But that's time consuming because you got to go find it. Well, now the AI, what it's doing is it's sending a few things that are innocuous. There's nothing attached to them. The first three won't do anything to you. But what it does is it teaches the AI what you will and won't read and what you will and won't click on. I thought that was scary as hell. And one of the things that I worry about is that we're coming out of COVID, and we all have a lot of things we want to get done. The digital surface is much wider than it was because so many more people are using it, which means that those are more accounts that could be subjected to that. And in particular, they're newer users. They're users who are more amateur users, or they're not quite as been through our security services. So I worry that we're headed towards another event that will sort of then push everybody to go do something they probably should be doing now, which is transplanting a lot of their, to these new services. Like if you've got what they call, and we had a guest on, her name was Knight. She scared Tom so bad he just passed out almost. She talked about how she hacked into ATMs from the parking lot camera. But she was saying if you've got a signature-based platform as a security platform, it's over. Those days are gone. To your point about the same thing the Heroism is doing in the Falcon, if that's what it's looking for, they know they know not to wear the red shirt or whatever the flags are.
Well, I mean, you think about it, it's not that hard. I mean, I don't know if you know Sam Brownwell, but he's got some tools that have gone out and just looks at every credit union's website, figures out who your online banking, your mobile provider, online account opening vendor, if you're using CU Student Choice, et cetera, and just catalogs that. Okay, so great, you got this catalog of information. It's a pretty easy bot to kind of build and put all that together. Then you figure out, okay, I can exploit this weird combination of Alchemy plus Fiserv plus this. Yep. Okay, who are the 43 credit unions? I've got my 1,000, stolen identities. And on Tuesday, I'm going to rush through 1,000 applications across all of these things, right? But before the credit unions even know what's happened, right? Boom, they've hit, they've hit, all 43 and exploited all of them and moved through that.
That's exactly
And
what she was talking
already,
about. Yeah, that she was saying that once she figured out, because it's a credit union thing, it's not necessarily as true of the banks and regional banks and the larger banks where they're using products, but mostly that's built themselves, so it isn't the same from one to one. Terry pointed out on LinkedIn that people are, still putting in, oh yeah, I'm in charge of the Fed system. I got the keys to the vault, kind of a thing.
There was someone, I love this. I think FI Navigator goes out and they can tell you every system the credit union's using by just ingesting LinkedIn information across the industry, and they know who's using Scimitar, who's using Fiserv DNA, because they just look at everybody who's got it in their resumes over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And it's not that hard to put together at all, right?
No, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be. So before we get into questions from folks, which I want to do, and I see Paul's joined us as well. I wanted to, what else should so what else should people know about the book other than it has a great forward? I mean, the forward is outstanding.
The forward is amazing. Yeah, the best.
Yeah, it is amazing. I say that because I wrote the forward. But other than that, why should folks be, I mean, I know why, but I wanted to hear from you. And what should they expect? They put the time in, they read this, but should they buy it for their senior staff? What should they do?
Yeah, so when I'm thinking about writing a book, I try to focus on the intersection between the board, the CEO, and the management team. And how do I take a topic that people may be thinking about, but you guys may already be saying these things, and give you a tool to have some other idiot on the outside, say it, so that it's not always your political capital in that respect. And so that's the first place I start with. So it's designed in that respect. I tried to be a little less prescriptive in this book than in CU2, where I think it was pretty tactical.
Yeah, you were. Yeah, this is less. This is more informational.
Yeah,
I think it's a little earlier to the game than the digital marketing was.
Yeah, this is designed to be much more educational, ask a lot of good questions, and really think about where things are going and where do you need to be skating towards, and what things did you need to do along the way to make sure that you stay on the trajectory that you think you're on. Because my guess is a lot of people, if you are not on Google, Amazon, Azure, and you are don't have a robust analytics platform live right now, right? You've got two major things that you've got to do to be able to even catch up to where the new entrants in the marketplace are, each of which is a 2 to 3 year project, right? And so I think the urgency piece of this, is a key part of what I always try to do, is to make sure that we're thinking of this, to make sure that we're still sitting here 5-10 years from now, and we aren't the blockbuster, right? That someone came in and came up with something new that just totally ate our lunch and we didn't see it coming, right?
Yeah. So, and you talk about the AI first strategy. Maybe before we get questions, just give a little background on what it means to be AI first.
Yeah, so I think AI first, making sure that you've got the set of technologies, cloud, data analytics, data normalization, external data sources identified and know where you're going, and rapidly moving towards those. Secondly, I think making sure that as you evaluate new systems, technology, et cetera, that you're making sure that they've got this in the roadmap and they're thinking through not just machine learning, but what the next couple of things are. And then third, I think having the conversations with your board and your management teams around where are the boundaries that we're going to be comfortable with? Where are the boundaries that the marketplace is going to be comfortable with that we are not, right? And that's where there's going to be the friction and the pain that comes in. And how fast do we need to get there? Is this a 3-month problem? Is this a 3-year problem? Is it a 30-year problem? And making sure that you've really properly identified, the days, Fiore will join on this, the days always are faster and the years are longer, right, than you think it's going to be, or maybe it's the reverse. I don't remember what the saying is, but yeah, it always seems like it's going to happen faster, than it is, but it still happens.
Yeah. Well, and the major systems that seem, so when you say, hey, to be AI first, I should be looking at these. So for example, I could see AI obviously playing a great role in lending, particularly as margins get tighter. I could see AI, I don't know that a lot of people have thought of this, but certainly would play a big role in onboarding in the future. But where I'm most interested in, and it's something you covered a bit in the book, but I think this is going to be, to me, the hardest changes, where it's going to have the revolutionary effect is going to be from the member's perspective. So, for example, and we're already seeing this from Citi and from Capital One and Chase, where the AI is now beginning. I'm going to call it autonomous banking. I think that's kind of where we're headed, the Tesla of banking. It's a subscription-based model where you say, hey, here's all my money, here's all my bills, and here's a picture of me, my license, and please, I don't want to think about this. I just want to use my debit card and spend. I mean, that's kind of,
Well,
I think,
it
the
makes me
dream.
think, like, if someone, maybe John, you create a little AI listener on my email that just sits there and notices when I get a bill, logs into online banking, checks if it's in bill pay, gives me a quick, do you want to pay this or not? That would be fantastic, right? Like, I wouldn't have, like, it could just move the whole thing through, and every month as these things are coming in, I'm not even thinking about it. I just get to the end point that say, yes, I'm ready to pay those, right?
Well, and I see things like, I was talking to, believe it or not, and I'm going to have him on the show, and it's going to freak you out, but Scaramucci. So I was having a conversation with him, and he was a huge investor in Klarna, Plaid, and also Chime, which is interesting. So he has a big fintech background.
Yeah.
And I asked him why, and you think about that autonomous account, Klarna, something like Klarna. For those of you that don't know, Klarna is a POS lending system. It takes something that you're buying, and maybe you don't want to pay for it right there. You want to distribute it into 5 equal payments or something like that, which some assets that makes more sense, right? Large TV buys from Costco or things like that, rather than depleting your savings or something, but to put it in that space. So I think that's interesting. So let's take some questions. Paul has been itching to ask something. I can tell. He's like, he keeps, I can see he's hovering a finger. So go ahead, Paul. And then
Great. Thanks, John. Great job, Kirk. Kirk, I think the quote you were looking for was Bill Gates. People overestimate technology in the short term and underestimate in the long term.
Yeah, that one. There we go. We'll go with that.
Yeah. But no, my question is, are credits participating in innovation labs now? Let's say for DeFi, decentralized finance or crypto, or projects that we know are coming, and credits probably need some help and caught up.
Yeah, so I think you have a couple of standalone ones. You've got Digital's Innovation Lab, and then there's a couple other credit unions that have lab-like things.
Our innovation club that you participate in.
Yeah, the big innovation club. I also think there's you have a couple less. What I'm not seeing is outside of big, I'm not seeing this collaborative, let's get 20 people together, let's have some, or 50 people or 100 credit unions, and have some structured criteria of how we're going to look at these, and and how to move them through there. I think that's there's a definitive need. Maybe John, you and I need to have another conversation afterwards, around that, because I do think the pace. I mean, I am blown away. When I wrote the book, when I first put the CU2 website up, we had 1,000 fintechs cataloged. We've just given up, right? I must come across 15 or 20 new ones weekly without any effort. I'm not even looking for them. They just fall in my email box. And so my guess is we're well past the number of credit unions now with the number of fintechs, and the fintechs are an international competitive, environment, not a national competitive environment the way we had historically. And if you add crypto and the rest of those in there, it's just a huge environment. And I think there's a huge need for a more defined process. But I think we also have to, the challenge, I think, which we saw at C Wallet, we've seen with lots of new innovative stuff that comes into the credit industry, is how do you move it from Skunkworks' interesting idea to a business, right? And make that leap and do it fast enough, because credit unions will give you the capital, but if it's not ready for growth, you end up in this in-between state of, hey, it's an interesting idea and I like it, but it's not quite ready for me yet, right? And so that gap between pilot and production is really painful to cross that chasm. And I think the innovation labs, I've certainly seen it at DCU, but others are really having an impact on that, and we could do that much better as an industry.
But Paul, just to answer that question a bit, most of the other technology, I term it like chasing a bus. The bus takes off, and unless you get something that's faster than the bus is moving, you're not catching up, right? You're sort of pegged at state with it. But AI is one of the few technologies that's coming that could be a leapfrog technology. It could be the kind of thing where it's not a bus we need to catch up on. It could catapult you past everyone else very quickly. Like if you happen to stumble upon the magic algorithm of, I can give cars at 0%, and I can make loans to homes at whatever, and at the same time include solar or whatever that package is, and the AI figures that out for you and establishes that as a package. That's the kind of thing that's driven other, like Chime and others, really forward very quickly. So I do think that AI is one, a technology that could catapult, and two, it's desperate for collaboration. In fact, it's dependent upon it. It's in the trading space and in the finance space, it's just not going to go anywhere without a collaborative process. And it's actually a weak link of the larger banks because they won't collaborate on that. So they'll be sort of packaging that up as opposed to having something that's cooperative. Tom, so you're a CEO, Tom. You're sitting here, you got to look out to the future. You're trying to decide. You're listening to us go, you got to go hire a chief AI officer, and you're like, yeah, right. But before I do that, I just got to figure out how to give somebody a credit card when they join, or whatever. Give me the shtick. Tell me.
Okay, I'm going to reel this way back.
Okay.
Because Kirk said something early on. He said, when you're talking to your vendor, you need to ask them the questions about AI. And it hit me. I thought, where does AI sit in my ecosystem? So I've got my core production banking system, my mortgage system, my student loan system, and all this. And I equate it to like a data warehouse, quite frankly, where that's another thing that's plugged in and it's drawing power. So where does AI sit in this whole world? And then what are the questions you have to ask those vendors to make sure it's interoperable, or what, so that it can play nice within that pool. And PS too, at the beginning of the presentation, I went out and I bought the book. The paper versions, well, I'll tell you two things. The paper version's out of stock.
It doesn't actually exist.
But the Kindle was 99 cents, Kirk. I'll throw you a buck.
No, I'm not. Well, just make sure you click to the end so I get the full buck. Otherwise, Amazon just gives me a proportional share. Yeah, no, we're still in the launch phase. So, John will tell you don't make any money on the book. So I'm not all that concerned about that piece of it. So I think it's a great question. Where does AI sit between the core and the credit union or any of those systems? And I think, in some ways you have a philosophy that has to be deployed. In some ways it's the actual underlying technology, which is your analytics kind of starting point. And in some ways it's the actionable automation side of things, right? And so you're right that it needs to sit between all of those things, but it really starts with the philosophy. And I think as you read the book, I think you'll have some good ideas around how to have that conversation with the vendor. But I think that's a good enough question that I'll write a blog of what that structure is and what questions to ask in that piece, because I think that was not something I addressed in the book, but I think it makes a lot of sense.
So I want to address it just for a second. So I see it evolving a similar way, right? So if you look at the whiteboard I've done, you've got lending. And so let's say you bought a lending product, and this is in between 2000 and 2015, Paul Fiore, digital insight times, right? So I'll use home banking as an example. Most credit unions didn't have this warehouse, right? So what would happen is this would have its own data, like little tool, and it would tell you things, and this would have its own little data tool, and it would tell you things like digital insight told you how many people, and you could produce reports from them, and then you could put them all together and turn that into a board report. We agree, right? And then we grew into this CU warehouse where we started saying, oh, we got to get this data here and this data here so that we could process them together and do things with them. Agreed? And so that was the transition. But here's what I'm suggesting, Tom, and your question is absolutely fantastic. I'm suggesting that you leapfrog don't do this. I think what you want is you're going to have lending and it's going to have its AI. And you want to make sure that the question I would ask them is, yeah, I can use your AI, but can I also use mine? And let me explain that in just a minute. Same thing with home banking. You're going to want to say, I get it, I can use yours, but I want to use mine too. And so let me explain that. So they may have their own internal AI, because the transition we went through was that most people didn't have this and it took a long time. So they all had their own little things. I think what you want is this centralized AI kind of a thing. And what that's going to do is it's going to be the kind of thing that says, okay, if we're doing lending for somebody, we can push it through this and get back what I'm going to call inferences or not necessarily decisions, but data points. And you're going to want to be able to do the same thing between this. So for example, I'll give you an example of that. Let's say I log into home banking and I say, I'm going to open up a CD. I'm going to take you up on this percentage over the next 10 months. You've got this great deal. How does that, but it runs through the AI and it goes, okay, before you do that, let me give you the impact of a couple things on that. This is what the yield would have been if it stayed where it was. This is what the yield is if you put it here. And oh, by the way, we noticed you have an asset over here that's, you might be better taking that money instead of putting it into the CD and putting X amount of it in to drop this down to reduce PMI off the whatever. The centralized engine is the only thing that can do that, because this AI is never going to connect to this AI in the same way that data analytics never crossed that chasm either, because they all were fighting to be that one main thing, right? But it turned out you can't have any. What they need to be good at is lending, and what they need to be good at is delivering the service. There will be something like this because it's got the same identifiable characteristics as a centralized data warehouse. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And the frustration, I'll use another example too, the false positives on a debit or credit card transaction frustrates the shit out of me.
Right.
I'm running the organization. I bought Bradley's book
Right.
a couple of weeks ago, Bradley
Right.
Limer. And
Limer.
I went to use my Aspire debit card to make the purchase, but the book is actually being bought in England.
Right.
So the AI Falcon said, no, fraud, danger, Will Robinson.
Right.
I had to use a competitor credit card to get that done. Well, I'm sitting here. This phone is sitting here. I have my app on it from a higher level of authentication and all. Why can't that system talk and say, well, hey, Tom is in Clark. The phone is in Clark. It's probably him. So let's push that through. We can always do a check later on with a call or something. But these systems don't talk to each other. They're their own little silos. And we do more to drive away members because of this stuff. Because to them, it's our problem. It's not an FI problem.
And we
it's
look
our problem.
stupid. Yeah.
It's only when they go somewhere else they realize, oh, this is a bigger problem than just what I had.
Right.
By then it's too late. So that's to me is an extremely practical application of this.
Well, and that's why I'm saying, I think you want to jump ahead to start thinking about that centralized AI, tie it to your data analytics. And then as you look at organizations that have their own AI, you want to be able to either augment or supplant that with yours, because they're not going to know all the things that could come through. And so, because we have to learn from the past, and the past and the evolution of data analytics was very slow. And it was because data was all siloed. And and Paul, it wasn't you that did this, but when you first developed it, it never occurred to us, and I was there with you, that we would have to take all that data and dump it somewhere else. We were just trying to store it for ourselves to give the people support. It never occurred that people would want to action on the type of browser that they're using, and that could have some relation to the type of loan you might give them, or that all of that data was so pertinent. And so, so as that time wore on, the hindsight played out. But I think we have to take that hindsight into perspective now and say, okay, let's skip this portion of it. Let's skip the portion where everything has its own AI and does stupid things, just like you said, where they're siloed. So for example, I was talking to a group that Fedor, which was out of Germany, and one of the AI concepts they had was, if I bought my plane tickets on Fedor, well, and then I suddenly, in next moment I show up in wherever those plane tickets landed, hey, maybe John's probably where that is. And so let's not do a bunch of stuff and say he's not there. But what was interesting about that aspect of it, Tom, was the pull through of now I'm encouraged to buy my plane tickets. And so I see AI, and this is interesting, Kirk, it's a concept, but the AI is going to be smarter it's finally going to lead to maybe that PFI, because it's going to be smarter in the sense of the more it has of your data in one place, the smarter it can be. And that's an example. If it knew about the plane tickets, then it wouldn't bother you with the other. So that's gonna be a pull through, and it's going to be a pull through for a lot of other stuff. And so I think the quicker you can get that AI, I mean, I see AI rewards in the future. Use our AI system to pay your bills or whatever. We want to reward them for that, because that's going to lead to more margin for you and more margin for them. Really, it's going to be the autonomous banking. I should write the autonomous banking.
And like any of these things, I mean, I think you could start from the member perspective and work in. You can start at the back office perspective. And I mean, I could see some credit unions having success with saying, hey, we're AI free, like GMO, we're just not going to use that because we want to protect our community, right? And you could see different variants of this coming out. So I think that first question is, do we believe this is going to happen? When do we believe it's going to happen? What are the key things? And if you go through 4 or 5 of these scenarios, you're going to come up with, like in any strategic planning process, you're going to come up with the 3 or 4 things that you have to do in all of them. So you might as well start on that first step. And then as you get that first step, you reassess where the market is and what's happened, and you take the second step. But if you don't get those first, commonality pieces and keep those doors open as long as possible, that's when you get yourself in trouble. Doing nothing is the problem. Yeah.
John, Kirk, you had a thought earlier that reminded me of something. You basically talked about you're a member, you have multiple bills, and some come in the mail, some are electronic, some you have to log in and pull in. And at the end of the day, they're all going to wind up in some bill payment queue eventually. It almost reminds me of like if you have an Ethereum smart contract where you're doing Aave connects to your private Coinbase wallet. If the credit union had a system where you don't need to create a username and password on Aave.com in order to initiate a smart contract to lend a crypto coin. It would be the same way where all the third parties, you as a consumer could delegate, where the credit union's payment portal collects all the bills that need to be paid, and you don't need to create a username and password for every electricity bill, water bill, et cetera.
Yeah, actually, we've been talking about that. It's a subscription-based process. And interestingly enough, that's the whole self-sovereign identity, right? Because right now, if your address changes, you have to go all these places, right, Paul, and update the address. And the worst one is your credit card won't work until the address is right, because you moved. So if they subscribe to some sort of Paul service, right, which is where your bills would go, then you could take that service and say, hey guys, my address changed, and everybody would just get that update. And by the way, you could decide who gets the update. For example, I want to keep, Paul's probably, he's a billionaire, so he probably has, houses all over the world. So he only wants Aspire to have his house in New Jersey, but he wants somebody else to have his house in, I don't know, I need a really exotic place where Paul could own a house that would make him laugh, but I can't.
Oregon, Malibu.
You already said New Jersey. That's exotic.
That's correct.
Well, he's from there. So. But my point is, it is 2:00, and unfortunately, I want to be respectful. This was a fantastic discussion. Kirk, where can people find you if they want to learn more, and if they're interested in talking to you about this?
Absolutely. I'll put my contact information in the chat, right. And feel free to reach out at any time. And I'll end on this. Pre-COVID, when you landed, if you're using the United app, it knew what gate you landed at. It told you where to go, told you how much time you had to get between those pieces, and was already using that AI piece to know based on your phone GPS signal where you were and where you're going. And we're already 5 years behind, right? Like that's the funny part, right? Like it's the applications, the use cases are abundant, and it's all about how do we, begin to digest this a lot faster.
But you got to start somewhere, and this book is a great place to start. I'm going to be doing a full review on this, and so I'll probably post that out on the web for everybody to take a look at. But really fantastic book. It seems like I've been doing a lot of book stuff, so highly recommend it. Again, if nothing else, for the 2-page forward, it's really brilliant. It's almost poetry, really. Written by
Well, that was
some
what the
guy.
99-cent Kindle version was supposed to be. It was just the forward.
Do I get the forward then? Do I get the?
Sure.
Do
I'll
I
send
get
you
the
those
money for
notes.
that? Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.